Welcome. Thank you for joining our Best Practice Series webinar. I'm Becky Melody, your hostess for today's presentation. Jay Crowley, USDM Vice President, Subject Matter Expert for the UDI practice, will be presenting. The discussion today will cover introductions, webinar logistics, and our discussion topic, meeting the requirements of the UDI final rule, an FDA perspective. We're proud to have Jay Crowley joining the USDM team. He's worked for the Food and Drug Administration for 27 years and most recently as a senior advisor for the Patient Safety in FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health. He developed the framework and authored the requirements for the FDA's unique device identification system. Jay also led the team responsible for the development and implementation of UDI requirements. With USDM Life Sciences, Jay focuses exclusively on providing business process, technology, and solutions for the regulated life science industry. USDM Life Sciences is focused exclusively on the life science domain. We're the market leader in providing quality and regulatory compliance professional service solutions, and we're headquartered in Santa Barbara, California. We've delivered more than 1,000 successful projects with over 300 life science clients. We offer hands-on experience assisting clients under regulatory distress, and we're the market validation accelerator packs. Our various dedicated practices include global quality and auditing, IT and virtualization, life sciences in the cloud, GRC, laboratory, both systems and equipment, ECM, ERP, PLM, enterprise quality management, manufacturing, automation and equipment, clinical and drug safety, business intelligence, project management, and of course, the UDI track and trace practice. The content today covered in approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll invite you to post questions onto the iLink message board, which you'll see left of your screen, or you can join our discussion out in the USDM LinkedIn group and post any questions there, or we're happy to address questions for you as well. Just shoot us a note at usdm@usdm.com. Thanks for taking the time to join us today, and with that, turn the presentation over to Jay.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for joining. As Becky mentioned, we will be here for about 30 minutes. You can see here, hopefully, the agenda. We're going to talk a very high-level overview of the final rule and some key concepts. We'll talk about the timeline that the device industry is under to meet these requirements. Talk about some of the industry concerns and issues that have surfaced to date, and talk about implementation, both for the global UDI database or Good IT, as well as changes that are necessary for meeting the rule in terms of labeling and packaging and validation. And finally, we'll sum all this up and move to some Q&A, hopefully at the end of the presentation. So let's talk at a very, very high level. Hopefully everyone has had a chance to read the rule, to go over it. There's a lot of details, a lot of exceptions and issues to get into. But at a very, very high level, manufacturers will be required to do 3 things before they put a product into commercial distribution, given a particular timeline. They're going to have to obviously pick an issuing agency and then assign or enumerate all of their devices and packages with the correct device identifier from a particular accredited issuing agency. They will then have to apply that device identifier onto the label of a device in a human-readable and AIDC technology. The rule does not require any particular AIDC technology to be used, so that you're open to use linear barcodes, two-dimensional barcodes, RFID. And the UDI, except for Class 1 products, also has to include the production identifiers, so lot numbers, serial numbers, expiration dates, whatever is on the label of that device needs to also be part of the UDI on the label and on the package of those products. Certain devices, those devices that are intended to be reused and reprocessed between patient use, need to also be direct marked. So this is where you put the UDI on the device itself. That's a lot of devices, including reusable surgical instruments, as well as devices that are used in hospitals, say an infusion pump or ventilator. And then finally, what is probably the most challenging aspect of the rule is to develop, organize, and submit data to the global UDI database or Good ID. There is a draft guidance which was published with the final rule that goes into a lot of detail about the requirements, the data elements, and how that information needs to be submitted. And again, I encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't already. The timeline listed here, the rule published on September 24th of 2013. That started the clock for implementation, and based on September 24th, then 1 year after publication of the final rule, or September 24th of 2014, all Class 3 devices must meet the requirements of UDI before they're put into commercial distribution. In 2015, we have what we call the FDASIA devices. FDA Safety and Innovation Act required all implants and life-supporting, life-sustaining devices to meet the requirements 2 years after publication of the final rule. That's about a quarter of our Class 2 products. The remainder of Class 2 devices must meet the requirements in 2016. And finally, in 2018, all of the Class 1 devices must meet the requirements. Direct marking has an additional 2 years to meet the requirements, and there's also an exception for existing inventory, an additional 3 years beyond the compliance timeframes that we just talked about. Okay. There we go. So a number of concerns and issues have been raised to date. I'm just going to highlight a few of these, some issues that people need to think about as they are talking about and thinking about how they're going to implement UDI, particularly for those devices that have that are manufactured by one organization, distributed by others. We have to decide who is the label of that product, and therefore who is responsible for UDI. We have to think about label changes. Where is UDI going to go, both the AIDC as well as the human readable portion of it. You need to think about which AIDC technologies you're going to use. A lot of linear barcodes are used today. Is that what you're going to continue to use? Will you move to two-dimensional barcodes or other AIDC technologies? You need to think about how UDI is going to be applied to kits, lots of different kinds of kits and to combination products. Also need to think about your master data management strategy. How are you going to organize and maintain all of the data that's required to be submitted to the Good ID? And finally, how are you actually going to submit that data to the Good ID? What technologies are you going to use? Is it going to be through the electronic gateway, or are you going to do this manually through the web interface? So a number of other issues that need to be thought about as you move forward in your UDI implementation. A graphic here representing a number of the things that need to be thought about as you are working towards UDI implementation. You need to obviously analyze where you are, develop a strategy and a plan for implementing UDI based on the final rule. Then you will need to actually execute whatever that plan is, make the necessary changes to your packaging lines, to your labels, implement your Good ID solution, and finally move all of this into actual production. Excuse me. And we are here to help you with that as well. Again, slide represents a number of the issues that need to be thought about as you move forward, and USDM is here to help you make those changes. Finally, a number of issues to consider as you're moving forward on UDI. It is a very broad activity. It requires activity from a number of different players across your company. So you really need to think about it as a systemic implementation. Be sure to include not only people who are involved with packaging and labeling, But UDI will also be used, for example, as part of adverse event reporting. So for those folks involved with MDR, with recalls, with other parts of product identification, you'll need to be sure to include those people in your UDI activities. We talked about the implementation time frame. It is focused first on Class 3 devices and devices listed under the PHS Act. And so it's important to understand what your device portfolio looks like, understanding the timelines that you need to meet, and being sure to focus first, of course, on the Class 3 devices. We don't have a lot of time at this point. September 24th of this year, you need to have the labels and the packaging and the data submitted before you put a product in commercial distribution. So understand what your product portfolio looks like and how many devices you have in the Class 3, and then understanding what the subsequent timeframes will look like. As I mentioned, you also need to think about how UDI is going to be used throughout the life cycle of the device. So we think about MDR reporting, recalls, quality systems, and be sure to include those folks that are involved in those activities as well. And finally, and I think the most important part, is to make sure that you're working with your stakeholders, with your trading partners and other stakeholders to actually utilize UDI, the benefits that we all hope to accrue. The benefits to any particular manufacturer are really only going to come about once UDI is used successfully by all of the stakeholders. So be sure to include your trading partners and other stakeholders in your conversations so you can understand what they're looking for moving forward. And finally, with that, Becky, I'd like to turn it over for some questions.
Thank you, Jay. Appreciate you so much taking the time and sharing that information. I'm sure it's going to be helpful for majority of the people on the line here today. We will open the floor to questions now. While you're typing those questions in, I'd like to let you know that this session has been recorded and will be available on the USDM website, usdm.com. I know many of you are familiar with our capabilities in compliance projects, but did you know that USDM has 3 different delivery options? Our project team supports start-to-finish compliance, which is led by SME practice directors or the SME project managers, and utilizing USDM team members with various skill sets. Based on client preference, we can be flexible and be available to work on-site or remotely. If you need extra hands to meet some project deadlines, USDM staff augmentation supports your internally managed projects with solid team members offering skills and experience specifically needed for your project. The goal for us is client delight, which then results in repeat business and excellent referrals. The third option is USDM On Demand, and that's a blended on-site, onshore, offshore model for managed services around development and support and validation testing. And that approach incorporates cost savings and offshoring while reducing your risk and ensuring higher success than traditional offshoring. Love to talk to you more about it. If you're interested, just let us know. Okay, looks like we have some questions coming in there. The first, Jay, is from Joanne, and she is asking, how do I choose an issuing agency?
Thanks, Becky. It's a great question, and I would encourage a manufacturer who has not already decided on a particular issuing agency to consider not only the requirements from the US FDA perspective, but really understanding where your products are distributed globally, and understanding what the requirements of other countries might be. So in the US, we have a fairly open process. We can accredit and have accredited 2 organizations. The FDA has accredited 2 organizations to date. They will likely accredit a 3rd in the future. And so you have some options here in the US. When you talk globally, though, you might find that there's more limitations. So I encourage you to look at where your products are distributed today, where you might be distributing those products in the future, and look at the potential UDI requirements or actual UDI requirements of those other countries. And you'll find that there may be some limitations there implemented by those particular countries. I also would suggest that you take a look at the various standards and that they have in place in your product portfolio, understanding whether or not your devices, that the standards of those issuing agencies will be met, but can be used for your products, and look across the organization to see what you actually need to implement. And finally, the different issuing agencies have different tools and resources available. You may need some help from an issuing agency, you may not, and so take a look at the tools and resources they have available to help you decide which issuing agency to use. And I would encourage you as well, before you actually start down this path, to determine if you already have a relationship with one of the accredited issuing agencies. We found that manufacturers often, or certain parts of an organization, might not know that they already have an established relationship. So take a look at what you already have. If you're not sure, reach out to them. They will let you know whether or not you already have an established relationship with them. Next question.
Wonderful.
Becky?
Yes, thanks so much. Okay, so Kevin is asking about the UDI labeling requirements around service and repair.
It's an interesting question. In general, there aren't any UDI requirements specifically associated with those kinds of activities. If you bring a device back in and make some repairs and send it back out, that's not a trigger for UDI requirements. Neither are many of the service repair parts that you might distribute to the owner of the device. They are usually not subject to UDI as well. But we might have to do a little bit deeper dive on that question to be sure.
Yes, and we're happy to do that. Kevin, if you want to just shoot me a note and follow up, we're happy to address that more thoroughly for you offline. John is asking, how would the company mark a reusable product that is small in size and don't have room to place the UDI marking? So very, very tiny things that the label can't incorporate for the piece.
We might need to take a look at the device itself. You could always request an exception from FDA to not direct mark the product. The direct mark can either be in an AIDC form or human readable. So you could always use an AIDC technology like RFID that really doesn't take up any space. But I think we'd have to maybe do a little bit deeper dive into the actual product to know what kinds of options are available.
Thank you, Jay. Okay, this is a cute question. Matthew's asking, do you anticipate that FDA inspectors will be looking for UDI compliance, and if so, when?
It is actually a very good question. And to date, FDA has not developed an enforcement policy for UDI. So the agency is very much interested in really seeing UDI adopted. And so there is not a specific enforcement policy in place. I would, if I had to guess, I would say, it's going to be 3 to 5 years before any specific compliance activities will take place. What they will be looking for, however, is fairly straightforward. Documentation in device history records that UDI was thought through and how it was applied. If you are taking advantage of for example, some of the direct marking exceptions, which are documented in the design history file, those need to be there. So I think it's a documentation largely of the thought processes that went into deciding how UDI was going to be applied to any particular device. But it will have to wait to see what their enforcement policy looks like. And again, I think it'll be a few years before that comes out.
Thank you, Jay. Christine is asking, does the UDI requirement apply to devices in clinical trials as well as commercial devices?
There is an exception for devices that have IDEs, so they don't need to be have UDIs on them. So as long as that device is operating under an approved exception, then UDI is not required.
Thank you, Jay. Payal is asking, who can become an issuing agency? Any private organization? How many issuing agencies will be accredited? Do they need to have similar experience?
It's an interesting question. We worked with, FDA worked with, I keep saying we as if I still work there. It's taking me a little while to come around from that. FDA worked with three organizations in particular as the rule was being developed, GS1, HIBIC, and IACC-BBA, folks who manage ISBT 128. Two have been accredited to date, GS1 and HIBIC. I would expect that IACC-BBA would be accredited in the near future. Beyond that, we'll have to wait and see if there are other organizations that decide to become an issuing agency. There is a series of requirements that are detailed in the final rule in terms of meeting a series of ISO standards and some other requirements that are required. But beyond that, there is no other specific limit to who can become an issuing agency. So we'll have to wait to see if there are other private. It does need to be a private organization. It can't be a government, for example, but we'll have to wait to see if any other organizations decide to become or to submit requests to become an accredited issuing agency.
Thank you, Jay. Gloria is asking, if we distribute a CD that contains a manual, does the About screen on the PDF file require the UDI numbers?
Not for the manual, no. UDI applies to sort of the corollary here is that UDI would be applied to a piece of standalone software that's regulated as a device, but the manual does not need to, other labeling does not need to have a UDI on it, so something like a manual, whether it was paper or on a CD, does not need to have a UDI associated with it.
Thank you, Jay. Esther is asking, for reprocessed instrument sets with hundreds of trials, themselves devices, was the FDA expecting all these devices to be entered into the patient medical record?
Well, FDA obviously doesn't have any control over what gets documented in any particular medical record, EHR, for example. A colleague of mine is working at Office of National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, ONC, working on some meaningful use stage 3 requirements around electronic health records, but that is mostly focused on implants at this time. So I don't think we would expect to see UDIs of say surgical instruments documented in patients' records, or at least not any time in the near future.
Thank you, Jay. Rhonda is asking, implementation of Class 3 device is due September 24. What if a device is classified Class 2 in the U.S., but as Class 3 in Canada, near patient? How is that device handled?
It's however the device is classified in the U.S. So there are various categorizations, both U.S., Canada, EU, but from U.S. FDA's perspective, it's how the device is classified in the U.S. So if it's a Class 2 device, if FDA has determined it's a Class 2 device, then it's subject to the Class 2 device timeframe.
Thank you, Jay. Okay, here's a combo from Paul and Elena, kind of on the same topic. Do you expect more than 3 issuing agencies to be accredited before the end of the year? Followed with Elena, which issuing agencies have been approved?
So, as I mentioned before, there are 2 that have been accredited at this point, GS1 and HIBIC. You can go to the website that FDA manages on UDI, www.fda.gov/UDI. And there's information about the two accredited issuing agencies. As I mentioned, I do expect that ICC-BVA either will or has submitted their a package asking to be accredited, and I would assume that FDA would accredit them. I guess, as I mentioned before, we had been working with them. FDA had been working with them for a number of years, and at this point, I don't know that there are any other organizations that are interested in becoming an accredited issuing agency. So, for now, we have those three, and I think those three will be the ones that are the primary focus for the device industry moving forward.
Thank you, Jay. John is asking if we know when the characteristics, attributes, requirements will be finalized.
I'm assuming this is about the global UDI database requirements. If it's not, please let us know if the question is different. And the draft guidance that was published along with the final rule details all of the elements that are required, or all the elements of the good ID, and I don't expect that those are going to change much. The database is built, it's operational, and it's not something that's easy to change. So there may be a few tweaks here and there to some of the data elements, but I don't believe we're going to see any significant changes in the data elements in the good ID. So I would move forward with the assumption that the data elements detailed in the appendix to the draft guidance will be the same as those that are in the final guidance. The agency does plan to publish subsequent guidance documents as the database morphs and evolves, but I don't expect any significant changes to those data elements.
Thank you, Jay. Mike is asking, what do you foresee with regards to other jurisdictions following the FDA's lead based upon the IMDRF guidance?
Right. So, great question, and hopefully, if you haven't had a chance, if you go to the IMDRF website, you can see the final guidance that IMDRF published on UDI. And it is the intent of participants in that work group, so Canada, the European Union, Australia, Brazil, other countries, to follow that guidance. So, and the guidance is aligned as well, or FDA aligned, the UDI rule with that guidance as well. So I would expect that it would look very, very similar to what is going on in the U.S. EU published recommendations last spring that look very much like the guidance document that was published. So I would expect that other countries will follow a very, very similar path to the one that we're on here in the U.S. right now.
Thank you. Roger is asking, will the GMDN device nomenclature be available through the GUDID web portal?
There will be, and it should be available quite soon. There will be a tool in the Good ID on the Good ID website for logged-in users, so for folks who have accounts, to be able to find GMDN preferred terms and to find what is called an FDA code for that. So it will not provide the GMDN preferred term code, which is intellectual property of the GMDN agency, but it will provide a code that a manufacturer could use when they are registering their device identifier record to associate a particular record with a GMDN preferred term. So that tool should be available soon. Alternatively, if you could always work with the GMDN agency, you can get a license and find the GMDN preferred terms through the GMDN web agency, the GMDN agency's website, and have an actual GMDN preferred term code. If you're selling in other countries outside the U.S., that will also likely be a requirement for other countries. So would encourage you to look at getting a GMDN license if you're selling outside the U.S. in particular.
Thank you, Jay. Sandeep is asking if you could please expand on FDA SIA devices.
Oh, okay. Good question. So the agency, we've been working on the UDI rule for some time, and right about the same time that the proposed rule published in 2012, President signed into law the FDA Safety and Innovations Act, and there were a number of additional requirements to the original UDI requirements that came out in FDA, the FDA Act of 2007. And in particular, it required that all implants and life-supporting, life-sustaining devices must meet the requirements of UDI within 2 years. So in November of 2012, the agency published an addendum to the UDI proposed rule that described how that particular portion of FDASIA was going to be implemented, and published a list of pro codes that we at the time thought were subject to the FDASIA implementation timeframe. That list did not change with the publication of the final rule. So if you go to find the UDI final rule on regulations.gov website, you will find a list of about 500 product codes, pro codes, that are subject to this 2-year implementation timeframe. So it's those mostly Class 2 devices that are either classified as an implant and or classified as a life-sustaining, life-supporting device, and those are subject to the 2-year implementation timeframe of September 24th of 2015.
Thank you, Jay. I know we touched on this earlier, but I want to go there again just to make sure. Rich is asking, human readable text must be easily readable. Does that mean readable without magnification? Some devices don't have much real estate for this.
Yes, it would be. The assumption is that it's something that a person could read without magnification. Agency did not publish minimum type size or anything like that, but yes, it's something that people are intended, that someone could read normally. And I recognize that there are, for many devices, significant space constraints on labels. There are a number of different ways to address this, and would be happy to talk about that offline.
Thank you, Jay. Rich is also asking, does direct marking include labels? I'm
going to answer this question, and it may not be the right way to answer it, so I'm happy to have a follow-on conversation. But a label could be a direct mark. So for some devices, an infusion pump, for example, that's used between multiple patients and cleaned between patient use, a label on that infusion pump would be considered an adequate direct mark for that device.
Thank you, Jay. Erin is asking, she says, my company manufactures a customizable device, comes in various sizes and configurations. How do we handle this in light of the new UDI requirements?
So in general, and we probably would need to get into some detail, but in general, you could assign a single device identifier to that configurable device, and then each particular instance would be reflected in its production identifiers. So you could have a device identifier for that whole system or that configurable device, and then as you create that device or manufacture that device for a particular customer, you would assign its own production identifier, and that production identifier would, from a quality system perspective, include all the details. So it could be implemented that way.
Tremendous, thank you. Stephen is asking, does the 3-year for existing inventory apply to labeling and direct part marking?
The 3-year exception for existing inventory is for all of the UDI requirements. So if you have a device that you manufactured, packaged, and labeled prior to the compliance deadline, you can continue to distribute that device for an additional 3 years without having to meet any of the UDI requirements.
Thank you very much. Kathy is asking, if you have loaner kits that are in distribution but they come back to the manufacturer after the compliance date, must they be brought into compliance?
Yes. Yes, that's commercial distribution. Yes.
Short and sweet. Tom is asking, what level of rework or how will UDI be viewed for the devices that have left the manufacturing facility but have not been received by the customer and they come the due date? So they have taken into receipt by the time the due date comes. Thank you.
I'm not sure. I don't think receipt is a trigger. So it's commercial distribution. So if you have distributed that device or putting that device into distribution, whether or not it's been received is not material. So it's the act of actually putting that device into distribution. That's the trigger for when UDI is required.
Thank you, Jay. Eileen is asking if the data entry begun, has the data entry begun into the Good ID? If so, are there any lessons learned that can be shared? What do you believe there will be searchable information for the public?
So the Good ID, as I mentioned before, is up and running. As of a month ago or so, there were a couple of dozen accounts that had been created. So manufacturers had submitted the necessary paperwork to create an account. But at least at the end of 2013, there were no records that had been submitted yet. So manufacturers were working on that aspect. So there's no further insight at this point into how the database is being used or any problems that have been found to date. There were, and it's publicly available, there were about 24 comments that were submitted on the draft guidance, and I know the agency is working on a final guidance. In terms of when the front end, when the public searchable database will be turned on, it's a little hard to say. I would guess it would be probably closer to June or July of this year. Once there's been some validated data submitted and it's there, then I'm sure the agency will likely turn on the public search tool.
Thank you, Jay. Kay is asking if we have projections, a swag, if you will, on the average cost of implementation and the time frame that a company can expect to recover those costs.
I think the question is around ROI, and we don't have any specific information on ROI, if that's the question.
Yeah, I believe so, Jay. It's so vast and various depending on the size of the company, the scope of the products going out the door. It's just so big, it's really hard to pinpoint that. But Kay, if you give me a call or shoot me an email, we can maybe help with some specifics around that as far as what we've seen or what we've experienced, and maybe with a little more of an answer there. George is asking, who at the FDA is now the primary point of contact for UDI regulation and implementation questions? Do we have their contact information?
All questions need to be submitted through the UDI help desk, which is available from the UDI webpage, fda.gov/UDI. The activities that I was involved in have been, the responsibility for those activities has been distributed amongst a number of different people, and they're looking to hire some additional people. The project is morphed from development of a regulation to actually implementation, so there are some different players and different activities that are taking place. But any specific questions that you have should be submitted through the UDI help desk that, again, is available on the UDI homepage.
Thank you, Jay. Okay, here's a tricky one. William is asking if you could speak a little bit more to the confusion around the bulk pack marking. He's asking if we can describe how the application of the UDI data should be managed on the bulk packs. For an example, these syringes are put into plastic bag as singles and then sold as a bulk pack of 30. Example 2, there's 30 syringes that are not packed individually but put into a bulk pack of 30 for sale.
And the question is, where does UDI go, I guess? So it would depend a little bit on how that individual syringe is packaged, but I'm going to assume that the individual syringe is not packaged, that the information about the syringe resides on the bulk pack. Therefore, the label is on the bulk package, and therefore the UDI would go on that bulk packaging label and not on the individual syringe. But again, we'd have to take a look at the specific instance or a specific representation of that device to know whether it would be on the label of that device or it could be on the bulk pack. There are some exceptions in the rule too, so it could be that you could take advantage of some of the multi-pack exceptions that exist in the rule.
Thank you, Jay. And it does sound like they're looking for the answer to both solutions. If these syringes are in an individual plastic bag in singles, and then those single units are placed into the larger bulk pack, if they do it that way, as well as a separate line that would put the 30 syringes together in one bulk bag. So we'll look into that a little bit further and address it together down the road here. I'm happy to connect with you, William, on that. John is asking, how does the UDI compare with GS1 barcoding?
So as we talked about before, GS1 is one of the accredited issuing agencies. So having a GS1 barcode, if you will, as long as it contains both in the GS1 world GTIN as well as application identifiers to identify the production identifiers of that device, then that is a GS1 barcode would be a UDI for the purposes of meeting the rule.
Okay, great. Thank you. Bianca would like to know about irrigation and the pump that is reusable. Would it require direct marking even though it's a Class 1 device?
Yes. So direct marking applies to all classes. So we could take a look more specifically at this example, but in general, regardless of class, if it's a device that's intended to be reused and reprocessed between patient use, which includes cleaning and as well as other processes, then it would require a UDI on the device itself. For many devices, it could be a label, as we talked about before, but for some devices, it will require other technologies.
Great, thank you. Let's see, does the existing inventory requirement involve devices that are used currently being used in the field, or only items in finished goods?
The existing inventory exception applies. Can you ask? I'm sorry, Beck. Can you say that again? Can you ask that again?
No trouble. Yep, it's Beck, and I'm asking, does the existing inventory requirement involve devices that are used currently being used in the field, or only new items in finished goods?
Okay. So for devices that are, sorry, I heard something different. For devices that are already out there, already distributed, UDI does not apply. So it does not apply to products that are already in the field. It only applies to devices that a manufacturer is putting into commercial distribution after the compliance timeframe deadline. So it does not apply, UDI doesn't apply, the existing inventory exception doesn't even come into play. So UDI does not apply to any device that has already been distributed, already in the field.
Thank you, Jay. John is asking if you can comment on the pack hierarchy implications. An example would be when a device can be shipped as individual unit or in a multi-pack. Oh, this is sounding familiar here. Does the multi-pack require its own distinct UDI, or is having the multiple devices inside the multi-pack sufficient?
Well, the specific question, does the multi-pack require its own UDI, is yes. So regardless of whether the individual devices within this package are marked, which is a different conversation, all higher levels of packaging also need their own UDI. So this multi-pack, whatever it is, needs its own UDI. Now, whether the individual devices within that multi-pack need a UDI, you would need to take a look at how that individual device is packaged and labeled, and whether or not the individual device would need its UDI, or if you could take advantage of the multi-pack exception. You need to take a look at the individual instance to know that.
Thank you, Jay. Bill is asking if you can elaborate on UDI requirements and timeline for software that is installed on equipment such as generators and pumps, etc.
So UDI doesn't apply to software, firmware, if you will, that's embedded in a device. The UDI only applies to what we call standalone software. So a piece of software that is itself a medical device. It does not apply to software that is used to, say, run a device like a pump.
Thank you very much. Jerry is asking that if you have a product carton with a transparent window where the sub-package can be clearly seen, can you put the UDI on the sub-package and not the carton?
Yes.
Good enough.
Yes.
Steve is asking, can the date of manufacture be excluded from the UDI barcode if the date is not used for traceability?
A great question, one that we've gotten many times. Unfortunately, the short answer is no at this point. I know the agency is, well, when I left, the agency was working on an exception that would allow manufacturing date to not be included if it was not used to control the product. We haven't seen that exception yet, so either need to wait to see if a broad exception comes out of the agency, or you need to submit an exception request, specific exception request to the agency to not include the manufacturing date if it's not something you use to control the product. But today, you would have to include it.
Thank you.
Regardless, yes.
Leslie is asking, if the date of manufacturing appears on the label but is only used to meet other country requirements, not for traceability, do you have to include it on the UDI barcode? Sounds very similar, I'm sorry, but we should answer that as well.
Same question, yeah, right. Yeah. So today, the answer is you do need to include it. Again, you need to wait to see if the agency comes out with a broad exception, or you can always have a specific exception request submitted.
Okay. Zach would like to know, would an insert or direction for use documentation included in the packaging of a device require the date format change in the same as the labeling and packaging is required?
No. They don't. The standardized date format only applies to the date on the label of the device. So expiration date, manufacturing dates, not to other dates that are in various parts of label or labeling.
Thank you very much. When do you anticipate granted exemptions will be published on FDA's website?
It's a good question. I know that there were a few that had been submitted, and they were working through them. I would guess sometime in the next month or so we might start to see some responses to exceptions that had already been submitted to the agency. Obviously it's a whole new process, so there's a number of issues that need to be resolved as the agency is working through what those processes look like. Hence, if you will, the delay in implementation. But hopefully in the next month or so, we will start to see responses to specific exemption requests that have already been submitted.
Wonderful, thank you. Pankaj is asking, what are some of the justifications for requesting extension for UDI?
Well, there are specific data elements that are required that are outlined in the rule, and if you go to the website and go to the help desk, you will find that there's a specific form for requesting an extension to implementation. In general, however, you need to show that you need to explain why you can't meet the deadline, and that not meeting the deadline is going to cause some sort of public health issue, so that your device not being on the market is going to be problematic for the healthcare system. You will need to justify that, explain why that is so. So sort of two parts to it. Why you can't meet it, and what not meeting it is going to mean for patients and clinicians in general.
Thank you, Jay. John is asking, is the UDI information manually entered, or are there automatic solutions available for reading and sending up this information?
So there are both. There is a web-based user interface for the Good ID, and go in and manually enter information. There are also a number of solutions that are available that allow for submission of the data through FDA's Electronic Submission Gateway, ESG, and we're happy to talk about some of those specific solutions if you're interested in one of those.
Thank you very much, Jay. Gloria would like to know if you could explain a little further about what standalone software is.
There are some examples on FDA's website of standalone software. So, for example, there's a PAC systems, picture archiving systems that exist as software, and they are regulated as a medical device. So there are a number of devices that exist as software, and those are the ones that are regulated as a device and therefore are subject to UDI. Happy to provide some further examples or to talk about whether or not the software that you have is regulated as a device.
Thank you very much. Paul is asking, he says, if he heard correctly, the manufacturing date is required in the barcode. So does that mean you need both the expiration date and the manufacture date within the barcode? Not sure, for example, that the HIBCC label format supports that.
HIBIC does support it, and if you do have both on the label, again, you have an expiration date as well as a manufacturing date on the label, then yes, both of those need to be part of the UDI. Those are two production identifiers, at least those two production identifiers would need to be included.
Great, thank you so much. Tim would like to know, can individual devices from the same production lot use the same UDI production identifier, or does each individual device within the production lot need to be uniquely identified by the product identifier?
No, it's a great question, and I think it's in retrospect, if we could go back a decade, we might change the name of this project. So each UDI does not require, even though it's called unique identification, does not require changes to the way that devices are currently identified from a production perspective. So if you have a lot controlled product, then yes, all the devices within that lot would have the same UDI. It does not require that you change how you manage and the production identifiers that you use to manage those products. So no, you don't need to individually serialize, if you will, products that are currently managed by lot control.
Thank you, Jay. Kevin would like to know, is there any requirement to DPM products already in commerce after the 3-year exemption? Does this also apply to consignment inventory?
So the UDI does not apply to devices that are already in commercial distribution. And the 3-year existing inventory exception, I think we've talked about. So it's devices that are manufactured, packaged, and labeled prior to the compliance deadline. Have an additional, you can continue to distribute those products for additional 3 years. Devices on consignment are considered existing inventory. So you can take advantage of the existing inventory exception for devices that are on consignment as well.
Thank you, Jay. All right, we'll take one last question here, and then we're running onto the hour, so we'll have to continue at a later date. Leslie would like to know, related to the field inventory question, if the items in the field are on consignment or still owned by the manufacturing, do they need to be labeled and part marked after the 3-year extension?
Yes, yes. So you would need to, again, coming back to the sort of existing inventory, things on consignment are considered in inventory. So you have an additional 3 years to use those products up, but at the end of that additional 3 years, so let's say it's a Class 2 device that's otherwise subject in September 24th of 2016, you have till 2019 then to use it. Is my math right here? Yes. To use to get rid of those, to use those devices up. But after that point, you would need to bring those products back in and mark and label them to be UDI compliant.
Thank you, Jay. Tremendous information here. Y'all can see why we're so excited to have Jay join our leadership team, and we're just so excited. We will be continuing the discussion here. We'll do additional UDI-related webinars in the very near future. I would encourage you, if you have the moment, to visit the USDM website. You can find more information there around our upcoming webinar events, as well as recorded sessions from previously presented topics, which across our 14 practices, you might find some information that will be useful for your team there. We'd love it if you could join the discussion forum on LinkedIn and to stay up to date with upcoming events and presentations there as well. We also are very open to feedback. Let us know that we're on the right track with sharing information that's useful to your team, and we'd like to hear suggestions for future presentation topics. Let us know what you need to know so that we can help you on the road to compliance. Thanks again, Jay, for presenting today, and thank everyone here for taking the time to join us. We certainly appreciate the opportunity to team with you in working towards excellence in compliance. Have a wonderful